Settler colonial ideology still frames the majority of research that has been used to develop frameworks and policies that are put in place to ensure children are safe and taken care of. The problem is that Western research further enforces policy and framework that drives individualism and isolation from family and community. Indigenous culture is a collective. This means that children need to be with the people they identify with. Indigenous identity is obsolete to a well-balanced health. Culture is specific to Indigenous nations. Intergenerational teachings and knowledge are often passed down through family and kinship. The community is kinship, so caregivers for Indigenous youth and adults cannot access a relationship with the parents or immediate family. It's the caregiver's responsibility to reach out to the community to find a way to nurture the service user's identity and sense of belonging to their community. This knowledge and support from kinship, family, and community develop identity, purpose, and belonging. In my experience as a social worker for Indigenous youth in a group home setting relates specifically to identity. Youth thrive through engagement with their community and family members. Acts of participation in the community, ceremony, and cultural activities like naming ceremonies, sundances, and powwows nurture the collective idea of kinship and community support. Without this connection to where they come from, their Indigenous nation, youth often experience re-traumatization and learn to isolate as protection. As a result, they lack coping skills and their mental health and well-being pay the price. There is a direct correlation between incarcerated Indigenous adults who are in foster care system. Next slide, please. In the article, Experience and Well-Being Among Indigenous Youth in Care Within Canada, it is concluded that many Indigenous communities are taking active steps to find children lost in their child welfare system, to care for these children and to rekindle cultural identity for them, with the goals of healing, reconciliation, and cultural restoration. It is imperative that child welfare agencies support the development of positive culture, identity, spirituality, and connection to cultural communities for Indigenous children, youth, and their families. And another article titled Cultural Connectedness Protects Mental Health Against the Effects of Historical Trauma Among Anishinaabe Youth, Young Adults by Gray and Coates. A common selective cross-section of Anishinaabe people between the ages of 18 and 39 from a community were invited to complete a brief questionnaire. Associations were calculated between Indian residential school attendance and cultural connection and mental health. A total of 147 people participated. Among participants without a family history of Indian residential schools attendance, cultural connectedness was not significantly associated with improved mental health. Among participants with a family history of Indian residential school attendance, a high level of cultural connectedness was significantly associated with a 31% greater probability of reporting high mental health and mental health status similar to those with no family history of Indian residential school attendance. Cultural connectedness appears to act as a strong specific protecting factor against the intergenerational effects of Indian residential school system on the mental health of Anishinaabe young adults, providing epidemiological support for the nation of culture as a treatment. It must be remembered and advocated that frameworks and policies that are developed take into account that culture is specific to its nation. That means the systems that are already in place were developed with research that was conducted by non-Indigenous scholars. These systems require an update. In order to help nations and communities heal and help themselves, the old ideas and structures have to be withdrawn, and implementation of cultural specific frameworks and procedures must be put into place. Indigenous children belong in their community. It is in this ethical space that we wish to access and begin to change the relationship. As Willie Ermine explains, how do we reconcile worldviews? For example, how do we reconcile oral tradition with writing tradition, the two embedded traditions that we have confront and must reconcile? This is the fundamental problem of cultural encounters, shifting our perspectives to recognize that the Indigenous West encounter is about thought words may remind us that frameworks, or paradigms are required to reconcile these solutions. The theory of ethical space is one such framework, and configuring ethical, moral, legal principles is cross-cultural cooperation at the common table of the ethical space will be a challenging task. Allyship means being in an ethical space all the time. It means being ready and willing to go into hard discussions on the truth about the history of Indigenous nations. And the truth is that the child welfare systems and correctional systems continue to oppress and damage the health and future of Indigenous nations. Thank you, Heather.
Okay, Leanne.
That one's not my slide.
Okay, reciprocity. Reciprocity is an ethical starting space. Reciprocity in many cultures is an acknowledgement that both sides have power during the process. Example of reciprocity is Kovach on page 63 of Ethical Space. When two converging entities come together, they are creating an ethical space where good working relations are the end goal. There should be an equal balance on the spectrum of what is to be discussed. Both parties express their ideas, concerns, and try to work through them in an ethical manner. No power imbalances. And I'll give this to, I believe it's Gilda.
Oh, okay. I am a board of director with Kasokowel here in Muskogees, Samson Cree Nation. Recent court cases and terminology used to define Indigenous issues within the judicial system, cases of power imbalances, and still a colonialistic view. You know, we have a situation where two Indigenous children of our own were, actually they still are, under the care of a non-Indigenous person. And our executive director delegation was removed from her, from the director of Alberta Child Services. And so we had no jurisdiction over our own children, or had no say what happens to them. So we took it to court and we won delegation. And then we also wanted to bring our children home. And we had to go through a court for that, a court order to have our children come back home. Now, what really baffles me is that this person who's non-Indigenous also applied for PGO after the fact that delegation was given back to our agency, our nation. And then she also applied for a temporary PGO, which is unheard of. So the judge who was presiding over our case called it a socio-political hybridity. Now, what that meant is that on her view, and she also stated this quote, I'll quote her, she said, "It makes us white people look racist." So now everybody was flabbergasted. Like, these are our children. And she granted this non-Indigenous person, again, custody of our Indigenous children. And the situation is so dire. When we had the children in our care, we were attempting to introduce the smudge and the culture and everything. And they said, we can't touch that, it's witchcraft. Our mom will be upset if she hears that we're doing this. So there's just that situation itself just calls for, immediate, I don't know how else to say it, immediate attention or something. But the way the law is sitting, and has jurisdiction over, our own children, um, the continuing fight to take care of our own is such a red tape issue when it comes to law and when it comes to um, situations such as this. So I don't know. We're still in the process of um, going to court. Don't know what's going to happen next, but it's really a heartbreaking situation, and I just hope that, and I ask for your prayers as well, that, that we're able to reconnect with these children and bring them back home, hopefully, or if we lose, for the foster mom to be open to learning our culture, to be open to teaching the children cultural connections. And I'll elaborate more on those cultural connections later, but I think it was important that, this story is told and that it's to be learned from. Excellent.
Hi, thank you for sharing, Gilda.
Hi. So one of the most detrimental forms of post-colonial behaviors stemming out of oppression is internalized oppression. So the adoption of the Western and colonial worldview itself, and today the psychological war still rages within our Indigenous communities, and it's witnessed in the youth and children in care, and they struggle to grasp their identity, their culture and their traditions. Hold on. So in order to promote our knowledge and shared understanding of the Nihia and the Siksikaitsitabe ancestral relations, I believe that it's vital to know our historical clan systems. This information here is helpful to trace the genealogy, our kinship history, our relationship dynamics, and gives us a deeper understanding of various aspects of our identity. For example, a person may embody multiple identities, such as your knowledge systems, or your gender, language, citizenship, nationhood, race, etc. And to gain greater knowledge about our clan names, our location, and our systems of ancestral relations, they were put in place, for centuries in our Blackfoot, ways. And then our clans also came with names, they came with songs, they came with colors, and then they had a role, they had a responsibility. And so with that, they also, they camped at different areas of the reserve. And I have a picture I think it's the right-hand corner, of how the bands were like the names. So many of those names have been like cut or replaced by Indian agents. And when I went in to try and trace my genealogy, I kind of had a little trouble. And so I had to go to the elders to find that connection. And my grandfather, his name is Moses McGuire. And then through one of the elders, they told me that his name was originally Ghost Skin. And so when the Indian agents saw that, they, of course, with, outlawing a lot of our practices and stuff, Christianity, they changed his name to McGuire. So it really made it difficult for our family to trace. But of course, through the help of our elders, the connection to that knowledge, that our ancestral relations, I was able to trace my kinship. So yeah, that was something that we thought, that would be really detrimental to learn, was to hold on to those teachings and that knowledge. I also wanted to share my experience stems from working with the Henry Three Sons Child and Youth Society. And in this setting, I worked as a child care worker. So the staff provided care for emergency placement, and the organization utilized a Blackfoot worldview to frame and create the operation of the homes. And it embodies our cultural practices, our relationality with all of creation, which is also encoded in our language and in our oral stories. So in that next slide, Heather, if you'll show the next slide. Okay, that one, it just kind of shows you how we've linked our stories, the stories of the Blackfoot into creating the homes. So the first home that was built was named Emanasi back in 2012. And that was it was actually built on the reserve. And then not long after that, they built the homes in the city in Calgary. So we have the White Crow, it's called IMSW. It was opened in 2015, and it homes 0 to 12, a medically fragile home. The services are 1-on-1-to-1. And then our bunched stars, there's that story behind the bunched stars. That one opened in 2015, 0 to 17 specialized services, and also 1-to-1 ratio. And then we have our elk robe. That one is for our female youth services, also 1-on-1 at risk. And then the 7 stars, male youth, also for 13 to 17, medically fragile, and 1-to-1. And also addictions and trauma for the youth. Those are some of the services that they provide. And in this setting, I witnessed a lot of trauma from the children coming into care. So having to de-escalate those behaviors and seeing firsthand the effects of them, being brought into care and reassuring them that they were in a safe environment. So I really got to experience a lot of the connection with them and witness the behaviors and also their needs. And I really thought that in this setting, our ways and the different worldviews between how to help and assist and support them was different in so many ways. So yeah, that was part of my learning journey and the experience. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Leanne. So here we have a timeline of Indian residential schools. So it is cultural genocide, and this is according to the Truth and Reconciliation timeline. So in 1831, we had the Mohawk Indian Residential School that opened up in Brantford, Ontario. The Indian Act engaged in giving government the exclusive right to create legislation regarding Indians and Indian lands. This act identifies who is an Indian and establishes legal rights. In 1883, Sir John A. Macdonald authorizes the creation of residential schools in the Canadian West. Sir Hector Langevin, Secretary of State for the provinces, tells Parliament, in order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people say this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. In 1885, the amendment to the Indian Act, traditional Indian ceremonies such as potlatches and sun dances were prohibited. In 1907, medical inspector for Indian Affairs, Dr. P.H. Bryce reports that health conditions in residential schools are a national crime. In 1951, major revisions were made to the Indian Act. Women were allowed to participate in band democracy. Prohibitions on traditional Aboriginal practices and ceremonies are removed. And that was in 1951. Next slide. So continued in 1958, Indian Affairs regional inspectors recommend the abolition of residential schools, and that was in 58. 1961, amendments to the Indian Act, status Indians can vote without having to give up their statuses, and that was in 1961. The Constitution acts as amendments and now recognizes and affirms the rights of Indians, Inuit, and Métis people of Canada. 1986 to 94, the United Church, the Catholic Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate, the Anglican Church, and the Presbyterian Church all issue formal apologies for their participation in the residential school system. 1996, the final report for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples is released. It calls for a public inquiry into the effects of residential schools and generations of Aboriginal peoples. 1996 to 98, a class action lawsuit begins to appear, including those headed by Willie Blackwater and Nora Bernard. In 2005, the Assembly of First Nations Chief Phil Fontaine announces a class action lawsuit against the Government of Canada over the legacy of Indian residential schools. In 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologizes to First Nations Inuit and Métis for the residential school system. In 2009, as part of an Indian residential school settlement agreement, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is launched and hosts events all across the country to listen to Canada who want to share their residential school stories. In 2010, the first Truth and Reconciliation national event was held in Winnipeg, Manitoba. In 2015, the closing ceremonies of the TRC were held. And in 2022, we had the Pope visit Musqueam for his apology. Next.
Thank you, Heather. I was talking, but I was muted. Sorry. Danse, Tawal, I welcome you all. That means little hawk in English. That is my ceremonial name. I just want to welcome you. Good morning. Welcome to virtual Treaty 6 and 7 territory. As you can see, a lot of the identity was detrimental to Indigenous peoples, and it shows in the residential schools. There were so many abuses, and it was a good recipe for colonization, to remove the children, take the children, take the identity, take the culture and spirit away. I just wanted to show some of the intergenerational trauma. I have pictures here. This is a picture of my late dad when he was in residential school, George Pegan. He's the boy on the right. And on the other picture, he's in the middle, front and center with the light coat. And I just look at that and I just think, oh my goodness, he was so young. And then on the third row, his sister, third row on the third left, that was his older sister, Agnes, my auntie Agnes. But residential schools systematically undermined Indigenous First Nations, Métis, and Inuit cultures across Canada and disrupted families for generations, severing the ties through which Indigenous culture is taught and sustained, and contributed to a general loss of language and culture. And this is artwork done by Kent Monkman, and it's titled The Scream. And back then in the Indian Act, the RCMP, Northwest Mounted Police, could forcibly remove children from their homes. And Kent is Swampy Cree from Manitoba. But he depicts the way it was, how children were just removed from their families, from their kinship systems, and how devastating that was for the parents to have their children removed. And then after the residential school system, we have the 60s scoop. And the 60s scoop refers to the time period primarily throughout the 1960s when Indigenous children were taken or scooped away from their birth families and communities, usually without the consent of their family and band. The term was coined by Patrick Johnson in his 1983 report on Indigenous children in the child welfare system. Throughout the 1960s and onwards, many Indigenous children were taken from their communities and adopted into predominantly white middle-class families throughout North America. The 60s scoop occurred not because the government was genuinely concerned for the well-being of Indigenous children, but primarily as an extension of the racist policies against Indigenous communities meant to assimilate Indigenous children into Western society and strip them from their culture and communities. So the 60s scoop was another trauma for First Nations and Métis. The 60s scoop was another stripping away of identity. I have pictures of my late cousin Erwin Pegan, and in the middle pictures is his younger brother Malcolm, and they had a younger brother, late Trevor Pegan. But those boys were scooped, and they were given to a family in Rimby, and the couple that had them, they were missionaries, and they took the boys all the way to Africa, and they grew up in Africa. And it was detrimental to my auntie because she tried to fight back to get her children back. And, you know, in this day and age, you're able to have that connection to your extended family and to your family. But my auntie did not have that option. They were way across the big water, and these boys learned how to speak Swahili. And the only time they were able to come home was when my auntie passed away. And my auntie was a residential school survivor, with the picture that I had previously shown. And she wouldn't speak of the abuses that she received in residential school, and most survivors do not talk about it. It's something that that really wounded the spirit, and she drank more after she lost her boys, and they came back for her funeral, and it was pretty much the saddest day because all they could do was cry because they never had that relationship with their own mother. So it impacts yourself and your identity. And my cousin Erwin, he passed away in Baden, Germany. He enlisted in the Canadian Army. And Malcolm, he's he's the most sought off water treatment operator. And we just lost their youngest brother, Trevor. He was found in the Battle Lake River here in Panoka. But you look at the intergenerational trauma because their older sister was also one of the murdered missing Indigenous women. And, you know, we look at the violence of it too, and their older brother, he was involved in violence where he was hit with a bat and it stopped his heart. And there was nothing they could do. So when you look at how intergenerational trauma affects children, especially in care, they come with levels of trauma and it's intergenerational. And, you know, we have to understand the intergenerational impacts. And after this, during a 60s scoop, there was Adopt the Indian Métis program funded by the Canadian and Saskatchewan governments. The Adopt Indian Métis program that was started to promote the adoption of First Nation children by middle-class white families in 1967. The project was started by Otto Dredger, who became Director of Child Welfare for Saskatchewan, and Frank Dornsdottir. AIM was the only targeted Indigenous transracial adoption program in Canada. And if you look at the ads, you know, safe in your hands, out of nowhere into here. And, you know, it's like basically telling First Nation and Indigenous and Métis that we have the inability to parent. And we have our own walkout within our kinship system. And all of those cultural ways of being were stripped away from residential school. So it just had a ripple effect. I'll let Heather play this video for you.
One of the many reception centers throughout Saskatchewan for unwanted Indian and Métis children. Jimmy, 2 years old, Yvette, 3 years, Rocket, 6. Only a few of hundreds ranging in age from 6 weeks to 6 years, they are the products of a sudden and sharp rise in illegitimate births and marriage breakdowns among Indian and Métis people. Until 12 months ago, they were becoming wards of the government at a rate of almost 200 a year, and adoption agencies were finding them almost impossible to find permanent homes for. But 12 months ago, with a 2-year grant from federal and provincial governments, a few men formed a unique adoption agency called AIM, for Adopt Indian and Métis. They organized a saturation publicity campaign with radio and TV advertising, and most effective of all, large photographs in provincial newspapers. Just completed its first year of operation, the director of AIM, Frank Dornsdottir, says results of this Canadian first have been extraordinary and unexpected.
One of the, I think, really startling results of the project was that we were able to place children of family groups. We placed, for example, we placed 3 family groups of 2 each, 1 family group of 3, and 1 family group of 4 children.
The project has also experimented with fast adoptions as quick as 10 weeks, and so far not 1 child of the 100 adopted has been returned to the agency from its new home. Craig Oliver, CBC News, Saskatoon.
Okay, Sandy.
Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So, you know, it's kind of surprising to see how, you know, it's how they made it sound like these children were unwanted and came from relationships that were single parents and whatnot. And so, you know, it was just a stripping away of identity.
And also, at that time, there was the Indian Act that was developed, which more or less oppressed our people because of there was so much that was, that affected the ways of the indigenous people at the time. And this was, it seemed like the only option. The marginalization that indigenous people were experiencing at the time, and the oppression, unable to fend for themselves because uh, there was the only thing available was the welfare system, for financial assistance. Work was scarce. Being herded onto a reserve where the opportunities were limited. The housing was just completely, null. Like living in a shack, it seemed like 2-bedroom shack with what, 8, 10 people in the building. So this is, to me, it sounded like this was the only option that the government had. And I don't know, it still baffles me to this day, why are we still in this era that reliving the old eras of the oppression, the poor housing, the poor water. And I couldn't believe that because there was no uh, healthy drinking water, that children were apprehended back in the day. So that's a shocker. And also the cupboard, the cupboard was empty. They were apprehended.
Thank you, Gilda. And a lot of kids were adopted, even as far as the US. And there is even a documentary on Finding Chloe. That was done by the CBC as well. So we have a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. The Government of Canada declared September 30th the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. The federal statutory holiday is intended as a day for public servants and all Canadians to recognize and commemorate the legacy of residential schools. The declaration of this National Day responds to Truth and Reconciliation Call to Actions number 80, which calls for the creation of a statutory holiday to honor survivors, their families, and communities, and ensure that public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools remains as vital components of the reconciliation process. And so we have Orange Shirt Day. Every child matters. Between the late 1800s and 1996, more than 150,000 First Nation, Métis, and Inuit children attended Indian residential schools. Orange Shirt Day, National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, commemorates this legacy. The Shirt Day movement was started by Phyllis Webstad, a member of the Switzerland Satem First Nation and former residential school student, to honor survivors and intergenerational survivors, and to remember those children who never made it home. Orange Shirt Day is an opportunity for people of all ages, backgrounds, and cultural identities to engage with the legacies of residential school system. And what's not said is one of the boys, he ran away from the Indian residential school. And when they found him, he was by the train tracks and he was wearing an orange shirt. So, it's, I'm hoping that we can put the reconciliation into action.
So basically here, we're looking at the residential school system and the current child welfare system. And there's some stats on here that are important for us as social workers when we work with Indigenous people. 2016 census noted that 52% of children in foster care are Indigenous. So that means that 15% of children in private foster homes under the age of 15 are Indigenous. Indigenous Services Canada classified 9,246 children as in care in the 2017 8/18 fiscal year. But that data does not include Inuit, Métis, off reserve, or Indigenous children of the Northwest Territories. And a question that raises for me is that does that unregistered children as well, or children that have the potential to be registered but aren't? And so that would change those numbers quite a bit. Cindy Blackstock said that Canadians might not be fully aware of the scale of ongoing systemic challenges facing Indigenous children. And anybody, Indigenous social workers, and anyone that works with children, Cindy Blackstock is a well-known advocate, and a lot of her research has proven a lot of the disparities that we see that Indigenous people on reserve and First Nations in Canada have experienced. And the comment that she makes there is that the federal government funds all public services on reserve for First Nations children and has done so at lesser levels than all other Canadians received since Confederation. In 2016, we actually got a legal order for them to stop the discriminatory preventions of services because it was driving these kids unnecessarily away from their families in numbers that far exceeded residential schools. The government welcomed that decision, but they didn't comply. That's a quote from Blackstock as well. So Blackstock and the Assembly of First Nations filed a human rights complaint in 2007, alleging that the government had discriminated against Indigenous children by providing less funding and poorer services than it did for non-Indigenous children. And in 2016, the federal government was found guilty. So colonization is not over. It has a new name. Children are still being separated from their communities. Foster care is a new residential school system, and the suicide epidemic is a new form of Indigenous genocide, and that's a quote. So looking at that chronic underfunding by the federal government to service on reserves at the disproportionate rate of Indigenous children in foster care. So that another note in that article that I cited is that in 2019, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ordered the federal government to provide $40,000 in compensation to each of the victims of its discrimination. And they had a court date that was scheduled a couple weeks later to get the government to pay out compensation that was ordered in 2019 to 165,000 First Nations children and families. So Cindy Blackstock stated that $40,000, keep in mind that's a loss of childhood and even a loss of life. It isn't very much money. And yet the federal government has yet to pay. The money since 2019 they have not paid one penny to these children. So the broad statements about how they're going to compensate, Cindy Blackstock said what it really means is that they're only going to compensate on their own terms. Next slide, please.
Hello. So worldview is defined as the fundamental character of spirit or spirit of a culture, the underlying sentiment that informs the beliefs, customs, or practices of a group or a society, dominant assumptions of a people or a period. So since contact between Indigenous people and the European settlers, Indigenous spirituality and philosophies have competed with dominant paternalistic worldviews. Little Bear describes the competition as jagged worldviews colliding, where colonization attempts to maintain social order by means of force and law. So based on this historical relationship, the following information was created to assist Indigenous workers, social workers, to navigate through the two worlds and work towards creating healthier partnerships with Western society. So first we'll look at, Indigenous ethos and ways of knowing. Sorry. So Indigenous ethos, it's more egalitarian compared to European. It's more hierarchical. And then the Indigenous ethos is part of we think of it as, we think of ourselves as part of a transcendent universe, and land for the benefit of all, and transfer of knowledge, which is sacred, compared to the European, where human is center of the universe and in control, dominant, and land is viewed as private property, and knowledge is for public consumption. And then we have Western ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of knowing. So Western is human-centric, focus on self, reductive and fragmented, hierarchy of knowledge. When I say hierarchy of knowledge, I'm thinking about like the dominant ideology. And then Indigenous ways of knowing, it's relational oriented, Indigenous spirit centered, mystical, holistic, oral, symbolic, inwardness, achieving connectiveness with the spiritual. And we seek balance. And then intergenerational. When I say intergenerational, I mean responsibility to future generations. And okay, the last one, immediate problem solving versus the intergenerational. Sorry, I skipped one. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Hi, thank you, Leanne. I just want to clarify that Leanna is our Blackfoot's sister from Siksika. And so looking at the inequality on the reserve, in 2018, a report from the Ontario Human Rights Commission found that the foster care system acts as a pipeline to incarceration. So Indigenous adults account for 31% of incarcerated people from 2018 to 2019, despite representing 4.5% of the adult population. According to Child Welfare Research Portal, nearly half of the instances where Indigenous children were found to be mistreated were attributed to neglect, with roughly a third witnessing intimate partner violence. In March, a report by Manitoba's Children's Advocate that reviewed the deaths of 19 young children in the province found holes in oversight and lack of support from child welfare, concluding that each death was preventable. The report, entitled Still Waiting, Investigating Child Maltreatment After the Phoenix Sinclair Inquiry, recognized the impact and role of racism, poverty, sexism, and colonization in child deaths. It found that 19 children who died from maltreatment between 2008 and 2020, 42% were First Nations and 2 children were Métis. The report acknowledged that almost 10,000 children in care in Manitoba, of the 10,000 children in care, 90% are Indigenous. The 2011 National Household Survey showed 38% of Indigenous children live in poverty compared to 7% of non-Indigenous children. And so a lot of these stats come from Cindy Blackstock, and she has an active Twitter presence, and she always documents and advocates on behalf of Indigenous children. And she has pointed out the reasons that Indigenous children are disproportionately taken away from their families and put into care, and they center around systemic issues of disadvantage and poverty. Next slide, please. And so looking back on the historical information that was shared, and even now, historically, legislation has been systematically oppressive, discriminatory towards Indigenous people, and that people weren't consulted or really considered the long-term effects or the lasting impacts of those decisions when those policies were created. And when you look at the what we have in our modern day now, we have the calls to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and monitoring The casework, cases and investigations is one of the first calls to action. It's child welfare. And so is consultation. It's in there. And so if you work with Indigenous people, even ourselves as Indigenous people and frontline workers, we've gone over the 94 calls to action and also the United Nations Declaration for Indigenous people. And another resource is River Thompson University has an article that is concise, and it breaks down the calls to action into 6 categories efficiently. And that's the image that I have there. And it's also in the resources. And so for myself, when I think about consultation and considering the 94 calls to action, I also included this picture of the late Richard Cardinal. I'm not sure if most people are familiar, if you work with children or if you're just even looking back. I think there's a documentary, you can Google it, Richard Cardinal. And if you haven't watched it, it would be worthwhile to watch, especially if you work in children's services. And I added his picture, and I consider him quite often in my practice because his death was preventable. He was removed from his relative's home because the home was overcrowded and he didn't have his own bed and he didn't have a room to himself. Richard Cardinal was in 28 different homes during his 14 years in the child welfare system in Alberta. After he was removed from his relative's overcrowded space, he actually journaled everything, and that the documentary goes into his journaling. And at one point he mentioned where he was moved into his own bedroom with his own bed, but it was in a basement, and that basement was flooding. It was dark, damp, and wet, and he became sick. And so I asked, how is that better than sleeping on the couch at his auntie and uncle's home? And when you think about maintaining that connection and sorry. Yeah, we'll take a break after this slide. So when we look at maintaining those connections to people that, you know, identified safe, loving, caring individuals that the child and the youth identifies as important. And it also raises another question about the standard. So when considering the homes, I know the standard on reserve would be very different from the standard off reserve. And so, and that again, raises another question of consultation. So that would require consultation. And who are you going to consult with? We do have, if you're working in children's services, we do have the First Nation designates. They're on the homepage of the portal. You can go on there, click on DFNAs, and you'll see, and you can also Google the numbers. And then also asking, like, another connection would be the communities that the Indigenous child that you're working with, who are they registered with? And making connections with the nation's designate within that community. And then asking that designate as well, if you can have those connections with elders, with an elder. And I know a lot of caseworkers are doing that. This isn't something new, that is part of our process. But it's again important to always consult and to have that coordinate that meeting with the elder and the agency from the child, from the community that the child is registered. And it's essential to practice because our future Indigenous children, the kids that we work with today and the youth that we work with today, they will thank you. And I know because, and they might not. I work in the field too. I know how it goes. But I know that even in that case, we'll have a better quality sleep, knowing that we did the right thing. And so, and this is important because we're not letting history repeat itself. We owe it to each other and we owe it to our children to make these consultations, to really explore how we can connect and consult with the community, the culture, and how that's going to be incorporated with the children that we work with. And we all have that role to play. And most importantly, consult with your kids. I know that especially in situations, there's some children that have been off reserve. But I know we have to work from a child family youth enhancement agreement. We have legislation, SIFIA framework and policies. And thinking about that framework, looking at the intake process, that rollout and the safety planning, you know, we have those bottom lines. So taking that same framework and those questions that we use when we're consulting with, you know, a group of people for intake, or when we're creating those bottom lines, can we take that same framework, modify it so that we're going over the peaceful, culturally friendly and appropriate connection to culture and community for the child? So that's something that I just wanted to share with you all. And that's something that I've learned to adapt in my practice. So next slide, please. So here, there's a couple more, the rights of the Indigenous child from Leona Makokis. If you work in children's services, you're probably familiar with Leona Makokis. Dr. Leona Makokis is, she's got some great resources. You can find her information on the GOA portal. I believe she's Cree from Kihiwin. So in our practice, our decisions have lasting impacts on the people that we work with. And I just wanted to look at that, you know, the Declaration for the Rights of Every Naheo Child. Oh, I'm sorry. I said we were going to take a break. So we'll take a break for 10 minutes and then we'll come back to this.